Welcome to Metaviews from Metaview Consulting. Does chocolate help mood and cognition?
Colin, I think for this Metaview, we're going to be talking about cocoa flavanols and their effect on mood and cognition specifically.
Do you mean chocolate, Andrew?
Not quite, but we can come to that. It's actually the flavanols within chocolate. So it's an interesting area, and it's an area that attracts a lot of interest, I think, from the media as well, because people love chocolate and they love the idea that eating chocolate could be good for you. Unfortunately, I don't think it's quite that straightforward. I know that we've both done some work separately and together in this field, looking at the effects of flavanols on cognitive function. And one thing I think that sort of kicked this research off is work looking at epidemiology, which seems to suggest that maybe eating about 8 grams per day of very dark, bitter, flavanol-rich chocolate can benefit both memory and attention.
Yeah, I think there is a view out there that eating chocolate in general has some beneficial health effects or properties, but it is a bit more complex because people eat different types of chocolates, and then there is the energy or the sugar content as well, isn't it? You have to consider.
Yes, and I think there's also some work that suggesting that chocolate's really palatable. That kind of great mouthfeel, as they call it, which in itself is probably likely to have some kind of benefits to mood. Just going back to the epidemiology, which shows that, I think, as I said, about 8 grams per day of very dark chocolate can benefit mood and memory. Why can't we just stop there and say, well, if this is what the cross-sectional studies show, why do we need to take that further?
That's a good question, isn't it? I mean, there's a big difference between epidemiological data and clinical trial data. So I think it's a good question for this area, because in clinical trials, we can actually isolate potentially the active component of chocolate, which are the cocoa polyphenols, and look to see if that improves some outcome. But in epidemiological studies, it's much harder to do that. Mostly the studies have just looked at the consumption of chocolate and how much chocolate. Sometimes they've looked at dark chocolate versus less dark chocolate, with the assumption that there's more cocoa polyphenols in the darker chocolate. But it's and then you've also got to partial out the sugar content of chocolate, and the negative effects that increased calories might have on a day-to-day basis. So in epidemiological studies like this, it's very hard to control for the things that we're really looking for. And so, once again, I think the clinical trial data is much safer in terms of our conclusions.
Okay, and I think we are going to dedicate one of these Metaviews specifically to the interpretation of epidemiology versus RCTs. Going back to cocoa flavanols, a type of polyphenol, maybe I could briefly just talk about a study I did many years ago, which I think was probably one of the first controlled trials of flavanols, looking in this case at the acute effects. So this was a trial in a cohort of young adults who came into the lab 3 times. One was a control condition. The other was a flavanol-rich drink, which contained about 520 milligrams of these cocoa flavanols. And the other condition was double that, or slightly more than double, sort of nearly a gram or 1,000 milligrams of flavanols. And they came into the lab. took that day's drink. I should say that the drinks were matched for all the other components that are found in chocolate, other than flavanols, and the order in which they consumed them was balanced. So there were obviously 3 potential orders, and we were very interested in cognitive demand. So this is a very intense set of cognitive tasks. So serial threes, which is subtraction of 3 from a starting number, then subtraction of 7s, so serial 7s, and then a task called the RVIP, which is where you have single digits firing up at you one after another, and you have to press a button when you get 3 consecutive odd or 3 consecutive even digits. And
so what do those tests measure in terms of cognitive domains, Andrew?
I think the serial subtractions are sort of working memory with a bit of an executive load, but not particularly domain pure. RVIP is a very classic test of working memory and vigilance. So, but the main
type of attention.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Attention over a longer period. In this case, it was 5 minutes. But really, the main aim of this set of tasks is that they were repeated in cycles over the course of an hour. So what happens over that hour is that people's performance deteriorates, as you would expect. And at the end of each cycle, they rated their mental fatigue, and mental fatigue goes up. And the idea using this sort of task is that you can maybe find a sweet spot where the level of fatigue can be, is sort of optimum to be negated or improved by an intervention. And what we found was that the middle dose, or about 0.5 gram of cocoa flavanols, improved performance on, in fact, on serial threes, and also reduced mental fatigue over the course of an hour. So that was an interesting starting point. And I know following that, Con, you also led another study or 2 studies into cocoa flavanols. Perhaps you could say a little bit about those.
Yeah, so this is a slightly different study where we're more interested in the chronic effects. So I guess, acute effects are short-term effects, whereas chronic effects are observed over a much longer period. So this was a 1 month between subject design. So we had essentially 3 groups: a placebo, 250 milligrams of cocoa polyphenols, and 500 milligram. These were drinks that we mixed up. They all tasted the same. These were taken daily by each participant for 30 days. We did do a little bit of acute cognitive and mood testing, a few hours after the sort of the baseline sample were taken. But then we're sort of more interested in what happened at 3 months. And so, and we used a battery called the CDR battery for this study, which we've used in a lot of our studies.
Yeah.
It's a good measure of attention and different types of memory. A little bit different than the cognitive measures you used in your acute study, Andrew. But we didn't find any cognitive effects for this study, but we found quite pronounced mood effects. So, having the highest chocolate drink dose of cocoa polyphenols compared to placebo made people feel more content and definitely calmer. So, I think it's consistent with why a lot of people eat chocolate. It makes them feel better. So, there were the results of that study. So, a little bit different than yours. And I guess, how do you explain those results? Well, potentially some of the measures that we used, you might want to speak about that, but potentially also the mechanisms of action of cocoa polyphenols. I mean, there's been quite a big literature looking at the cardiovascular effects of cocoa polyphenols. I think that's one of the really solid outcomes of this research, both from an epidemiological perspective and also from like a meta-analysis of clinical trials. Generally, you find better cardiovascular functioning. So, in particular, I think increased blood flow, and there are some blood pressure changes, I think, positive, a few other cardiovascular effects. And I think those mechanisms map on to acute improvement better than chronic improvement. That's would be my interpretation. What do you think?
That makes a lot of sense. I think you're right that probably there's this. I think you're right. It does seem that there's this cluster of cardiometabolic processes which we know can impact cognitive function and mood. And it's, I think, fairly well established that cocoa flavanols or cocoa polyphenols can improve many of these measures, things like insulin sensitivity, but in particular, vascular function, as you say. I suspect that those kind of effects may be more sensitive to very cognitively demanding tasks, because that might account for the slight differences between the two studies, where the CDR battery, which you talked about, is something we both use widely and is extremely comprehensive. But it's one of the neat things about the battery is that it isn't cognitively demanding. It's fairly easy to engage with, which makes it ideal for a number of populations. I think that could be a reason. Just sort of going back to your study, so you talked about a lower and a higher dose, but the higher dose was actually similar to the middle dose in the previous study, if that's right. So again, about half a gram. Yeah. So it's interesting that seems to be consistent. And what about the population?
There were slightly older, healthy people. So, I mean, I guess the other issue might be the time course. So perhaps 1 month isn't long enough for the chronic effects. I mean, we know that also that cocoa polyphenols are a type of antioxidant as well. And usually we think of the time course for antioxidants to improve cognition as being probably a bit longer than a month, potentially. Perhaps in this cohort, the mood measures are a bit more sensitive or a bit easier to see than the cognitive effects at 1 month.
There was a very widely publicized study which looked at 12 weeks administration, the Brickman study, which was published in Nature Neuroscience. And it seemed to show that cocoa flavanols may even promote hippocampal neurogenesis, so the birth of new neurons in this area of the brain that's responsible for many aspects of memory. This study was a little bit, well, it was widely publicized, but a little bit controversial, I think. If you remember, I remember us talking about it at the time, and the cohort was a bit messy. That is, these were, I think, sedentary, middle-aged individuals, maybe all males. And the study used, it was a so-called factorial design. So you had sort of people who exercised, people who took cocoa flavanols, and people who did both, and people who did neither. And they were sedentary, overweight individuals. So you would expect to see an improvement from exercise, but they didn't observe an improvement in exercise, which was a little bit strange, I think, but really intriguing data.
Sounds interesting. It'd be interesting to know the mechanism of neurogenesis.
They looked at a blood flow measure in the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, which improved, and certainly in rodent models, the same marker correlates very highly with neurogenesis, although those experiments are much trickier in humans, obviously. But yeah, very, very interesting. So
it sounds like then, Andrew, that given the cardiovascular effects, the blood flow effects, potentially neurogenesis, which we know is an issue as we get older, that a cocoa polyphenol consumption when we're older might be quite beneficial.
I think that's probably true. I think the take-home message is that things which we ingest, which are good for the heart, are probably good for the brain as well. But also, of course, a lot of these effects are very product specific. And unfortunately, I can't just go down to the 7-Eleven and buy the milk chocolate off the shelf there and expect to get a benefit. I think it has to be very flavanol rich dark chocolate with lots of cocoa polyphenols in.
You still feel happier though, would you? Acutely.
Yes.
By having some
Definitely.
chocolate.
Definitely. I think I'm going to go and buy some chocolate now.
I was wondering also for companies that are developing new products with just because it has such a strong cardiovascular effects that this could be used synergistically in new formulations. So if you could also combine cocoa polyphenols with other ingredients or nutraceuticals that might have different mechanistic effects, perhaps stronger antioxidant effects or anti-inflammatory effects or other effects, you could combine that with the strong cardiovascular effects and might be quite a nice product.
I think that's a really brilliant idea. We'll have to put our heads together and try and think about what kind of formulations might work.
Thank you for your attention. For more information, visit metavate.consulting.